Hello everyone, this is Charlie from the Bloomingdale Public Library and welcome to Introduction to IrfanView, free image editing software. I get the impression most of you haven't heard of IrfanView, seeing as there hasn't been many registrations for this class, but it's actually a very small and powerful program that we're going to be using in our computer lab for viewing, printing, and editing images, so we wanted to have a class so people can see what it is and what it can do. So what exactly is IrfanView? It's a free image viewing and editing program for non-commercial use designed to be simple, quick, and light on resources. It is a small download, and once it's installed, it opens extremely quickly, under a second, and because it's light on resources, it's a good program to use for image editing on an older computer. In fact, it kind of looks like it has an XP feel to it, but don't let that put you off. It is designed for Windows, but it can be made to work in Linux and Mac OS with Wine and Wine Bottler, respectively. We're not going to be getting into that today. IrfanView was created by Irfan Skillion, who has been updating and maintaining it for over 20 years. So if you're wondering where the name came from, well, there you go. It was named after its creator, and being 20 years old probably explains why it has that XP look to it. IrfanView can perform most of the more common functions of an image editing program like cropping, color correction, and file conversion, which we're going to cover later, but it lacks many of the advanced tools found in Photoshop. So I really wouldn't recommend doing too much more than what we just listed there in IrfanView. I mean, if you're very tenacious and you have the time, you could probably do a bit of photo editing, but you're probably better off with Photoshop or GIMP if you wanted to start trying to pull things out of the background or start blurring colors, things like that. So for free, but more robust image editing, we'd recommend GIMP instead. So with all that said, how do you go about installing IrfanView? What you do is you go to their website, click on the download button, follow the prompts, and that's really all there is to it. Let's go ahead and do that right now. So I'm going to go to IrfanView.com. Should come to a screen like this. Scroll down here. Unless you know you need the 32-bit version, I would go ahead and click on the 64-bit version. If your computer is over 10 years old, that might be a more likely scenario where you would just assume use the 32-bit version. So once it's downloaded, you go ahead and click on it. If you can't find it in your browser, you can go to the download folder or wherever you have your files set to download to. Click yes. You have a window like this. You can choose where you create your shortcuts and for which users it's for. I usually choose all users. I usually leave the installation folder alone. Click next. This just gives you a list of all the new functions and plugins and things like that. One thing that is new that has changed since I last used IrfanView, which admittedly was a while ago, was the ability to undo more than one step. So because of that, I didn't used to recommend using IrfanView as much, but now that is no longer an issue. Go ahead and click next. This is a screen for trying to set up your default apps. So if you wanted your images to open with IrfanView automatically, you should be able to set it here, but it does not work with Windows 10. So you usually just leave everything blank and click next. I would go ahead and also leave this at its default. And that's all there is to it. When you click done, if you leave everything checked, it's going to open by itself. And that is what it looks like. Like it said, it opens extremely quickly, but we don't have any files to look at yet. I'm going to go ahead and close that. If you did want IrfanView to be your default image viewer, what you would do in Windows 10 is go ahead and click on the Start menu, click on Settings, click on Apps, click on Default Apps, and where it says Photo Viewer, you would click on that and choose IrfanView. And it seems to be taking its time, but there it is, and that is how you install IrfanView. Now that you have IrfanView installed on your computer, you can use IrfanView to open up image files. If you follow along with me in the first section, you'll be able to open image files simply by double-clicking. So double-click on a file, and it opens up in IrfanView. And again, that's if you set IrfanView as your default image viewer. If you did not, what you can do is right-click on the image file, open with IrfanView, and there you go. Notice how quickly it opens. That's one of IrfanView's biggest strengths. So another way to go about things is opening IrfanView first. And just a quick note, you'll notice that we have IrfanView thumbnails. You can use this program to create thumbnails out of your images, but we're not going to be covering that today. I'm going to go ahead and open up IrfanView. I'm going to go to File, Open. You navigate to your image folder. Click on your image, click on Open, and there we go. And one other way we can open an image is by opening IrfanView, and with a blank canvas, just click and drag an image over into the workspace. And there you go. So now with a file in there and everything open, let's have a quick look at the interface. At the top you have the caption bar that just names the name of the file. We've got a menu bar, which looks pretty standard if you've ever seen a menu bar. Below that is a toolbar, which again is something you've probably seen in other programs. Just to go through what all these do, it's file open, slideshow, which we'll talk about a little bit, save, print, delete, cut, copy, paste, undo. I is for image properties, so it'll tell you the resolution, the directory where the image is stored, the dots per inch, etc. The zoom factor, which is an important thing to look at when you first open an image. If it's 100, you'll be looking at the image in its standard size. If it's way bigger or way smaller, it means you have a much bigger or much smaller image. So because the zoom factor on this image is set to 470, it means this is actually a very small image. So it's zoomed in quite a bit. If we set it to 100, you'll see how big the image actually is. If this number was very small, it means that it's zoomed out and your image is actually much larger. So to the right, we've got pluses and minuses for zooming in and zooming out. You can also use the little down button for a drop-down menu to select any of these percentages. You can also type in whatever you want as well. The left and the right arrows will go back and forth between files in the folder. So if I click right, you see we get an error because we're in the last image in the folder. However, if we click the left button, we'll go back to the rest of the images in the folder. So something to be aware of, this is just like closing and opening files. So if you make a change and you go back and forth, you're going to lose your changes. So that's something to be aware of. Then we have previous page, next page for extremely large images. We've got property settings, which is basically like preferences in most programs where you can set a bunch of the defaults and customize a lot of the interface. We're not going to be looking at too much of this, to be quite honest, but it's fun to just go ahead and make some changes and see what happens. I'm going to X out of that. And all the way to the right is just a little about window. There's Mr. IrfanView's email if you wanted to reach out. So that's the toolbar. Below that, we've got our workspace, which will conform to the image by default. If you don't like how the window always changes to the size of the image, you can go to View, Display Options, and go ahead and trial and error through all of these options to see which one suits your fancy. If you don't want the window to change at all, you can select Do Not Fit Anything and the interface will stay the same size. You can also click the Maximize button in the top right to just make it full screen. One last thing to make a note of is the status bar at the bottom, which again lists a whole bunch of attributes of the file, including the resolution, the date, and you can customize this to add a few more details as well. Before we get into some basic photo editing, I want to discuss using IrfanView as an image viewer, since I think that's how most people will be using it in the lab. You'll either be downloading images off the internet or bringing something in on a flash drive or your email, and then you'll open up the file to view it and maybe print it. So let's go ahead and open up our image folder again. Open up an image. And like we discussed before, if you wanted to see other images in the folder, you can use the right and left icons up in the toolbar. You can also use the left and right keys on the keyboard, or use the scroll wheel on your mouse. Again, if you hit the end, you're going to get that error message. So being aware of the scroll wheel is of particular note, because if you're doing any editing and you accidentally bop the scroll wheel, it's going to advance to the next image and you're going to lose your changes. So be careful. If you hit the enter key, it'll get rid of the rest of the interface, and the background can be customized to another color if black doesn't work. You also see the path to the file in the upper left corner, which you can either make go away or change the color of in the Properties menu. Hit enter to get out. And when you're ready to print, you go to File, Print, and it'll bring up this very familiar looking window. It looks kind of busy, but all of it makes sense. Of particular note, we've got the portrait or landscape setting. And depending on the height-width ratio of the image, you can set the paper to auto-rotate so it knows to match the paper ratio to the image ratio. And if you want to get as much of the page filled as possible, choose Best Fit to Page, and that will stretch the image as much as it can without ruining the ratio. If you do stretch the page, that's going to distort things a bit, which I think most people prefer not to do, depending on what the image is. So you can customize the size, the scale, the margins as well. If you get everything set to a particular bunch of settings that you think you'll be using a lot, you can set a profile. You can do that with image settings later, which I'll show you, and it'll work the same for this one as well. You can set your number of copies in the middle here. And when you're all set, you click print, and it'll send it to the printer, which is set at the top here. I'm not going to print anything right now, so I'm going to hit cancel. One last thing I want to show you in terms of viewing images is creating a slideshow. If you click on the slideshow icon, it brings up this screen here, which again looks kind of busy, but there's really not a whole lot to it. In the upper right corner is where you find your images. Mine are actually in the image folder on the desktop. You choose the images that you want to put in your slideshow. Click Add, or you can just do Add All, and it puts them all in this listing in the bottom right corner here. In the top left, you can choose how the slides advanced, either automatically or maybe after mouse and keyboard press. I'll set it to 1 second. You can set the looping behavior if you want it to loop, if you want to hide the mouse cursor. You can also set various text variables. I'm not going to get into that. But once you have your slides there, you have your slide advancement set. You want to play it in full screen mode probably. And from there you can either save the slideshow as an EXE or even burn it to a CD or DVD. I'll go ahead and save slideshow as an EXE or SCR. We'll save it to the desktop. Click OK. Click Create. And the operation is done. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. Let's take a look at our slideshow. There it is. And that's all there is to it. So that was viewing images, printing, and creating a slideshow with IrfanView. Now we're going to discuss some basic image editing. Again, we're just going to scratch the surface as far as what you can do. but I personally think it's kind of fun to float through functions and test things out and be surprised at the results anyway. Just make ample use of your undo button and be sure not to save. So anyway, let's start with rotation. If you want to rotate the image, you go to the image menu, choose rotate left or rotate right, and there you go. You'll also notice on the right side of the menu that there's shortcut keys. So if you hit L and R, it's the same kind of thing. And even though it looks like the image is growing and shrinking, it's just the zoom factor. The actual file dimensions are not changing. They're just trying to max out either the height or the width, and then changing the zoom factor to match. Next thing we can do is flip vertical and flip horizontal. That's flip vertical there. It'll put us upside down. Flipping horizontal, we'll go from left to right and right to left. I think it makes more sense for a bird to look left to right versus right to left anyway. Next item down is Resize Resample. So if you wanted to change the dimensions of your image to make your image larger or smaller, that is what you would do. So I believe by default you have preserve aspect ratio checked. So what that'll do is when you go to change either the width or the height, the other dimension will be changed automatically to maintain the ratio. So if I change width to say 800, you'll notice that the height changes automatically to match the ratio. You can also use centimeters and inches for your units, and when you do that, you may also want to pay attention to your DPI, which is dots per inch, and that'll affect how things will print out. Some other options you might want to tick are the apply sharpen after resample and the adjust DPI to again adjust the DPI for your growing or shrinking image, or the sharpness of your image as you make it bigger or smaller. On the right side you have some very common dimensions. Most of these are old screen sizes and new screen sizes. So if you wanted to jump to just a typical full HD pair of dimensions, just select that, click OK, and that changes the dimensions of the image. And you see here what the dimensions are. So I'm going to cancel out that, and I'm also going to undo the changes we made, just in case. And the next bunch of options I want to look at are color correction. So to do that, you go to Image, and then Color Corrections, and that'll bring up this window here. So you'll notice there's a whole bunch of sliders. Start messing around with those, and it'll change the image on the right. So you can see what the original image looks like on the left and what the changes will do to that image on the right. So you mess around with these a bit. That looks absolutely terrible. Bring it back down. And once you get it the way you like it, you can click OK. If you want to set everything back, you just click the Set Default Values. That looks terrible, so let's undo that. If you have a whole batch of pictures that you're going to want to make the same changes to, and I alluded to this before when we were discussing printing options, what you can do is go ahead and set your sliders to how you like it on one image. And then where it says profiles, you can go ahead and add a name. Click Save. Click OK. And now when I go to another image, I can go to Image, Color Corrections, go to my profile, click Load, and it'll apply all of those same changes to the new image. Click OK. It's a nice shortcut to working through a whole batch of images in a single folder. Again, just saving a profile and then loading it on the new images. So that's a bunch of editing options. We'll talk about a few more before we call it quits in just a sec. When I discussed the interface earlier, I left something out, and that's because it's not shown by default. And what I'm talking about is the Paint Dialog window, and you show that by going to Edit, Show Paint Dialog, or hitting F12, and that will bring up this bar here. And most of these tools should look pretty familiar, but we'll go through them all one at a time anyway. So by default, you're going to have the selection tool. It calls it the arrow, and when you left click and drag, release, you select a part of the image. So now with the selected part, anything that we edit will only be affected if it's within this selected area. To show you what I mean, I'm going to go ahead and click on our next tool, the paintbrush. Left click and drag, and you'll notice when I do that, only what's in the box is shown and anything else just doesn't even happen. All the way at the bottom is the pen width, so if you wanted to change the width of your pen, you can do that down here, bigger or smaller. You'll also notice down here that there is two colored rectangles. The one in the bottom is the foreground, and the one in the back is the background. I was playing around a little bit earlier, that's why it's yellow, otherwise it's typically white. So if I were to right click and drag, I get the background color instead of the foreground color, which is kind of neat. So you can draw in two colors basically at the same time. If you want a few more pen options, you click on this little brush here with the checkbox, and it brings up this window here. You can look at those on your own. If you click on the question mark, it'll give you a much more verbose description as you roll over each tool. I'm going to uncheck that for now. Next we'll look at the text tool. You click on that, click on the image, and it'll bring up this little window here. You set your font style to whatever you like, set the size to whatever you like, type in your text, and if you want to see what it's going to look like without going back and forth, you can click hold to preview and you'll see it show up on the image. If I choose filled path, you get the background and the foreground interacting like that. If you choose just text, you're just going to get the foreground. So once you have it the way you like, click OK, and there you go. So the size of your font is also going to depend heavily on what your zoom factor is and what the size of your image is. This is a very large image. If you look at the bottom left corner, you see it's 2000 by 1000. If this was like 200 by 100, the hello script wouldn't even fit in there. So be aware of your size of your image and your font size so you have a better idea of what things are going to look like. So a few more of the other tools. We've got the line tool, which basically is click and drag, and it will create a straight line. The arrow line does the same thing, except it puts an arrow on the end. Next is the ellipse. If you click and drag, it'll draw an ellipse. I'm going to deselect the rectangle so we can play around with the rest of the image. The rectangle, click and drag, draws a rectangle. If you wanted these shapes to be filled, at the bottom you'll notice our fill and transparency have become selectable. So now when I click and drag, it fills it in with the background color. The paint bucket acts like the paint bucket always has. So if you choose a foreground color, click OK, click on an area, and it will fill all of that continuous color with the paint bucket color. If you were doing something a little more complicated, you'll notice that it tries to fill in as best it can. If you wanted to paint less, you would decrease the tolerance. If you wanted to cover more of the image, you would increase the tolerance. So if I were to set this to 10 and then try to fill things in, you'll notice it doesn't fill in nearly so much. But if I increase the tolerance to, say, 50, it's a lot more liberal with how it paints in the colors. So there's a few more tools, and there's a whole bunch of options to look at, but that's the basics of using the tools in the Paint dialog window. Okay, so let's look at a few more things we can do. I'm going to go to Edit, Show Paint Dialog, make sure we have the Selection tool still selected, We're going to go ahead and select the sun. So it probably makes sense if we click cut, our sun goes missing. We click paste, we bring it back. But what might not be intuitive is now when we hit the left, right, up, and down keys, we don't switch it back and forth between files. We actually move the selection box. And we can go ahead and put it anywhere on the image, click paste, and we get a copy of what we had cut earlier. Move the box again, click paste. One more time, just to bring it on home. Click paste. So that is some functionality of the selection box you might be aware of, you might want to be aware of. One other thing you can do is, again, we're going to make a new selection box, and I'm going to click paste, and it's going to paste our selection into that box. So as you can see, it kind of shrank everything down to make it fit. If we make a nice big selection box, paste, it again stretches to fill our selection box. Let's have a look at some of the properties we can change here. So once you click the properties and settings button, I mentioned before how if you hit the arrow keys by accident or the scroll wheel, you can go back and forth to other files and lose your changes. If you wanted to get a save warning like you see in most programs, what you can do is go to the top menu here, Start Exit Options, go down to where it says Exit Options, and make sure this Ask to Save Changes on Program Exit or File Image Change is clicked. Now when I hit OK, I hit an arrow key, it'll ask if we want to save it before it actually jumps to another file. So, no. Now if I go back, it goes back to the way it was, but at least this time we had the option to save it. Another one that's good to look at is if you go to Viewing, go to Main Window Color. You see it's black right now, and it makes it hard to see the edges of the image. And if the edges of the image were black, it would make it impossible to tell where the image ends. So we can go ahead and click on that black, make it yellow, click OK, and now we can see the edge of the image a lot more clearly. If different colors made sense, then you can set it to whatever you want. So there's a lot more in here. Again, I just wanted to show some of the things you can do. Flow through here. Most of these will make sense. Experiment. Make sure not to save any changes or save copies before you do anything. And just have a look at what you can do. You can customize the toolbar even. So if you wanted something a little less Windows XP, choose your GNOME colors human. You can choose which options appear and don't by checking and unchecking the boxes. Click OK. And it gives you a little bit of a different look. So again, it's a little more you can do with the selection tool and a little bit of customization you can do with the properties and settings. And I recommend just floating through and testing things on your own to make things the way you'd like them to be. Alright, so we're going to finish off on file conversion and call it a day. So file conversion, it's for converting from one file type to another. IrfanView by default will open bitmaps, GIFs, TIFFs, GIFs, most of the mainstream file types. But if you had to upload to a website or convert to a certain image file type to use in another program, then you're going to need to know how to go from one type to another, and it's pretty easy to do in IrfanView. So for a single image, you go ahead and pull up your image, go to File, Save As. You can change the name if you like. I generally recommend saving a copy before you do any editing of an image, just so you always have your master image copy. Then save as type. Let's say you needed a bitmap. You can choose any that you like or need from this list here. We'll go with bitmap, and you can choose a new folder if you like. I'm just going to leave it and click Save. And now you'll notice that we have butterfly1.bmp instead of JPEG. If we needed to convert multiple files at once, there's a handy feature for that as well. So we go to File, batch conversion and rename. And this should look very similar to the slideshow. So you can, again, choose your files from the upper right. So you can either select one at a time or add all. And then in the upper left, you can either change just the type, you can convert, change the name, so that's a handy way of renaming multiple files at once, or you can do both, which I'm going to do just to demonstrate. So output format, let's go ahead and change all of our JPEGs to PNGs. And there's reasons why you'd want to use one file type or another, but I'm not going to get into that today. So for those of you that are more savvy, there are options for choosing compression levels, etc. for the conversion. If you wanted to use advanced options for conversion, there's a whole bunch there. Again, I'm not going to get into it. And then you have the naming pattern. So basically what you're going to see is the text in the beginning, and then these number symbols will be replaced by 001, 002, and it'll just automatically rename all the images with an incrementing counter. So let's say you had a whole folder of vacation images. You can go ahead and name this Vacay Fall 2021. And now every image will start off with Vacay Fall 2021 and then increment where these number symbols are. If you wanted to get fancier, you can click options and you can mess with replacing text, etc. But I'm not going to get into that today. And down here, you can choose where your new batch will wind up. I've got a little folder called Vacation. Let's go ahead and select that. And once you have all your files in the list here, you've got your name pattern set, you've got your folders set. Go ahead and click Start Batch. And it go ahead and one at a time converts and renames the file and puts them in the folder I specified. So I'll go ahead and exit batch. I'll minimize, and in my vacation folder, you see I've got all these same images, but they're renamed with an incremental counter at the end. So that's all I had for today. There's plenty more to learn. Feel free to experiment on your own. You can also go on YouTube. Be careful, there is a guy who has a channel named IrfanView, which has nothing to do with IrfanView, but there's a whole lot of other tutorials. You can also go to IrfanView.com and look at their fact page. So again, this will be something you'll see in our computer lab. If you need help with it, always ask one of us and we'll be happy to. Otherwise, thank you for viewing, and I hope you have a good day.